Hello and welcome to another episode of Bits and Bytes Live, the series of short LinkedIn Live presentations that we do here at VMware, where we talk about all things of interest through the lens of the communication service provider. I'm Nigel Stephenson. I look after market development for our EMEA region and report into our telco business unit. And today we're going to continue a series of conversations we've been having about sustainability. So we've talked in the past about a number of things. The last thing we spoke about actually was how we could leverage and use more clean energy. And to do that, I was speaking to Valentin Bondzio, who is customer sustainability architect within our office of the CTO. And I'm pleased to be able to welcome Valentin back. So welcome Valentin he's going to come back and join us again. And also welcome back from previous episodes, Stephen Spellicy, who is our VP of Marketing and Enablement, again within the telco business unit. So welcome, gentlemen. As I say, we're going to continue our conversation about all things sustainability-wise. We have mentioned a number of different aspects of sustainability. What we're going to focus on in this episode is possibly one of the core elements, which is energy and resource efficiency, in particular energy efficiency. So this is very much top of mind, not just from a sustainability perspective, but obviously very much from a cost perspective. So when we've spoken about this in the past, I had a conversation with Lorcan Burke, and he talked about a few principles that we can follow, and three of those principles are very pertinent to energy efficiency. We talked about the move towards virtualization and containerization and embracing that movement, which is obviously an ongoing aspect of our environment. We talked about observability and instrumentation, and we talked about the use of automation and AI. So I'm going to use those principles to kind of focus this conversation. Now, just as a bit of context, when we look at energy consumption, ICT generally consumes something like 3% of the world's power generation. So in general terms, it's massive. And network within the telco is actually the biggest chunk of that. And if we start looking at the distribution of different parts of the network, start looking at the RAM, for example, huge amounts of energy and huge percentages of energy are going into these aspects of the network. So it's a big topic, as I say, both from a sustainability point of view and from a business perspective. So I'm going to kick the conversation off. Stephen, if I could ask you a question. So I'm going to go back to those principles I mentioned at the top there. It's not new. We've been doing virtualization for a long time. I think we could probably claim 25 years now plus at VMware. But expand a little bit, if you could, on what we've seen from that, because we've looked at virtualization for different reasons, but we've not necessarily looked at it through the lens of sustainability before, and now we're starting to. So perhaps just give us a backgrounder on that, and maybe some of the things that we have seen now that we look back and look at it with a sustainability lens.
Sure, great to be on the show today. Thank you. When we think about traditional value proposition of what VMware has been able to do from a product perspective, our core products like vSphere have enabled customers to reduce their overall size of their data center operations, but ultimately increase the efficiency, both in the footprint context, as far as what you can do more with less, but also the operational agility around how people interact with the technology itself. When you think about power consumption for ICT specifically, the telecom industry has some of the greatest impact, both by footprint and consumption as it relates to energy. The average data center, if you think about the data center footprint in a region, it can be the equivalent of what's spent in CO2 emissions for the airline industry. So optimizing the data center footprint, taking advantage of the inherent benefits of technology like VMware, enable customers and service providers to be able to reduce the impact on the environment. And the technologies are pretty straightforward. There are mass consolidation capabilities within VMware's platform that enable the packing of workloads on a single system, the more efficient use of CPUs and memory, which reduce the overall power impact. So a smaller physical footprint, but a greater logical footprint, if you will. So they can run their operations, but they don't have to sacrifice, if you will, any of the hallmarks of scale or performance. The other thing that's really a value add in the architecture of VMware's products are around workload placement. So the optimal placement of workloads in order to gain the very best efficiency as it relates to power consumption. Again, it could be lower processor servers, it could be a lower powered processor servers, it could be taking advantage of our advanced technologies to manage P states and C states, which effectively optimize the use of energy in a server itself.
So that's good to start to mention some of the technology there, which is a good segue to go to Valentin. So on the one hand, it's quite really impressive, and you hear some of the numbers that the amount of energy saved over the years, the amount of CO2 avoided, etc. But actually, even though we've made a lot of progress, Valentin, you spend time looking at our environment and customers' environments, and I know from what you've told me earlier, they might not be as efficient as we thought. So even though we're getting savings, there's room to move. Yeah, tell us a little bit about what you see in terms of resources and capacity utilization in a typical environment when you're working with the customers.
Yeah, so of course, what Stephen just said, right? There is a lot of possibilities. But the first part is many people that use our products, our solutions, completely underutilize these capabilities, the features. It's not only about the footprint or the utilization of how much memory is consumed, how much storage, how much CPU, but also all of these features that enable higher densities, that enable more flexibility, right? Not utilized. Some of them are really just stuck to some of the base workings of the system. So there's lots of capacity there, so to say,
Right.
a lot of fun to extend further. But if you're looking at utilization, so CPU utilization, memory consumption, storage consumption, we see, or I see, sometimes environments, depending on the time of day, depending on what it is, 20, 30%. I've seen clusters, hundreds of hosts that are basically idling at about 5 to 7%. And that always comes out of the shock because, as you know, servers consume energy whether they're utilized or not. There is a large amount of static power that a server consumes, whether any workload is running or not. That's approximately 30 to 50%. So if you run it at 1% utilization, it might consume 800 watt. If you don't run anything at all, it still consumes 300, 400 watts. And that's a large amount of energy that just goes nowhere.
Wow. And so on the one hand, there looks like there's a huge opportunity to turn some of that capacity off, right? That would be the temptation. Let's just turn it.
You said it, not me.
Let's turn 75% of the capacity off because we're not using it. But Stephen, I'll come back to you. Especially in the telecoms world, it's not really as easy as that, is it? We've got, and I suspect, and I'll come back to Valentin in a moment, but I suspect the reason there's a lot of that spare capacity is because things are being designed for peak loads. There are other pressures on operators that require them to maintain levels of service and so on. So how do we balance that, or what's your perspective on the operator context, the risk context to this?
Yeah, CSPs on average utilize a network around 50% in steady state, which means that they built a network that can withstand much more. And so as they optimize for peak times and times a day, days a week, and they have that additional capacity in order to accommodate the additional resource utilization. Think of, when we were just inside the first sort of few months of COVID, just how crazy the network went with respect to utilization because everyone was working from home and the patterns completely changed overnight. So they have to plan for these peaks. And then sometimes in the case of COVID, we saw peaks last for a lot longer, and then they had to replan how networks were provisioned. That said, if we start powering off componentry in the network, things like radios inside cell towers, or we start powering down basebands, or if we start powering down other servers which are delivering parts of the disaggregated network within the core or provider's network, both in the core and in the RAN, we're going to see an impact. They have certain regulatory compliance they need to abide by with respect to supporting the critical services related to fire, safety, police, military and defense, to name a few. So there are just some things they can't do. With respect to SLAs, they need to be able to measure up and provide service for high priority customers and applications that are going to utilize that network. So we can't just simply power it down. So there's a balancing act here. It's looking at what choices we have, what can we safely do to stay within that safe measure of availability, performance, and utilization which the telco is required to provide.
Sure. And so Valentin, when you're talking to customers, how do you create this balance? Where do you start when you're looking for opportunities to I was going to say shut down. That's the wrong thing to do. To maybe claw back a little bit. As I say, I mean, it's very unlikely you're going to shut things down, because that would take a long time to restore. But where do you start to look for energy savings that balance this risk?
So I usually reframe shutdown as shut down some of these things some of the time, right? So this is more of an intermittent approach. It's not about shutting everything down, right?
Yeah.
It's a very gradual, very focused, very planned approach, right? That, again, takes planning and needs preparation. So again, part of this is just getting the discussion started. Like, we need to actually do something. We need to increase efficiencies and coming up with an idea of where we can possibly start, right? Because that's always the most critical step. And you can pick some low-hanging fruits. You can look at your test and staging environments. You can look at OSS, BSS, and you can certainly employ some of these mechanisms that, again, VMware has employed for the last 10 years to make things more efficient, that just haven't made their way into some of these aspects of the telco setup just yet. We usually, yep.
Sorry, I was say we talked. Just follow up on that. We went again at the top of the call there. I talked about some of the principles, and this is going to bring in the observability instrumentation piece, isn't it? Because if you're looking, so there are going to be certain opportunities that you intuitively know because of how the system works, or when the system is busy, or whether it's live or test. But once you start going a bit deeper, you need to understand what's actually happening in the network. So we need a monitoring and observability capability. What sort of things? I think we might have an example we might be able to show folks. But what sort of things can we do to understand what's happening in the network? Once we've identified an area we want to go look, how do we find it? How do we look at it?
So I might not go part of the network. I might go for our core infrastructure, OSS, BSS, and where we apply infrastructure visibility measures. And what we're seeing on the screen here actually is our area operations green score, which is a compound metric based off of different source metrics, where we can compare different environments, or in the future, parts of certain environments. Because telco has many, many different requirements. Some require VMs that packet core that are basically polling at all times. They're not going to be highly efficient, right? That's mostly the VM size and the workload size, and something that has to be discussed with partners. But again, other parts of the environment can be efficient, can be made more efficient. And we have these compound scores that tell us whether VMs are oversized, what the power source is, right? That's something we discussed last episode, and how to improve that, and what the data center PoE is. Maybe there are workloads or VMs that are no longer being utilized, and our operations can help you detect just that. What we see partially when we look at migrations or large-scale migrations is that many of the VMs that are running are actually no longer fulfilling a business need. They're no longer necessary. They were once in the past, but have been forgotten as service that had been delivered and shut off since then. So keeping track of that is highly important, and that's what the ARIA Green Score does. It gives you a relative scoring of where you are right now and where you might be in the future with regards to time, but also location if you have multiple environments. So starting there, because you can improve what you can't measure, right? So starting there is certainly important.
Cool. And then once we start to understand in more detail what's happening in the network, and we start making decisions, then that brings in the final sort of principle, which is adopting automation and AI and so on. And I'll come back to Stephen in a moment, because there's a lot of that happening in the RAN at the moment with the Open RAN developments. But sticking in the core network, if you like, Valentin, at the moment, how do we get into automating changes relating to sustainability? What kind of things are customers looking at and you advising people to consider?
So one of the, I'd say, fairly small impact, or can be very small impact, is highly de-risked host power management. So you can control, as Stephen said, P states and C states, and you can leave that control to ESXi. And again, if you leave it to ESXi, you stay in control, meaning you can turn it off and turn it on. You can reach 100% peak throughput whenever you need without running the risk of having to rely on some underlying power management features. So I have seen customers use these to adopt the schedule on when host power management should be active to their expected low utilization periods, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe at certain parts during the night. Same goes for powering things off. Our feature is called distributed power management, can be scheduled, and it can be adapted using proactive DRS as well, where you can decide how much to shut down at what parts of the day and when to bring it back up. So you have capacity ahead of the expected capacity or demand surge.
Okay, so there are some real practical steps people can start to take at the moment. Yeah. And I mentioned the RAN. I'll come back to you soon, because this is a bit that fascinates me, especially with some of the developments around RIC and RX, RApps and XApps. And I know we're actually, there's a few trials and lab work going on at the moment with customers in this area. Talk to us a little bit about what the opportunity is ahead as we look to opening the RAN environment in terms of the sustainability options that we're looking at.
I think we need to think of using the use of automation to improve how we operate in general, but there are various kinds of automation that can be applied in the context of RAN. When we talk about deploying a site or instantiating a new site, of which, whether you're in a pilot or with new 5GSA or non-standalone, there's a lot of work that goes into that. So some of that's physical oriented work, like racking and stacking and cabling and connecting and all that, provisioning physical infrastructure. There's an impact. There's an impact to energy and to the environment to send somebody out to a site and do that. And in fact, the second, the third, the fourth visit, there is a continued impact. And this may really be more directly related to scope 1 impact on energy consumption and green initiative for the telco, where they could save and reduce the amount of travel back and forth, or what we call truck rolls in the industry, related to servicing sites. Automation can be utilized to effectively operationalize workflows and software. So think of it as fewer physical hands-on and more of a software reliance, where it can be more centralized in operation out of a service center or a NOC, where technicians can actually run a series of workflows across hundreds of thousands of sites and do that over the network. And that saves time, and it obviously saves resource, and it saves money, and it also saves the environment related to the travel costs. As it relates to AI, gaining more insights using AI in the RAN is core to the strategy of where we're going to go with Open RAN, which is not only about disaggregation of the network to improve interoperability of componentry that sits in the RAN, which has been traditionally more or less siloed, more of a homogeneous style of a solution in the past, now more heterogeneous in nature. So as we move in that direction, there's a lot of innovation, and AI is a very big part of the Open RAN initiative, specifically the use of the RAN Intelligent Controller. The RAN Intelligent Controller sits either on the site or it sits in a centralized operation and has the ability to deploy logic that can drive intelligence into that part of the network. And we have some partners in this particular area that are doing great things around energy consumption. I mentioned, our own technologies as a foundational platform, but we have a large ecosystem of partners. Just a few that were showcased at MWC in Barcelona this March, late February and March, were partners like Viavi and IRA, who are both creating technology that is very specific to the utilization of energy in a cell site and the ability to monitor and modify the use of that energy. And those were just two. There were actually 5 out of 7 that had energy-oriented technologies that were showcased in that exhibit. And I want to go back to one other point that was made by Valentin a moment ago about measurement. Like, if we don't know what we've got, we don't see the impact, it's a big, big issue. And we have one customer, a telco in EMEA, that's actually been able to identify the energy impact and the savings per app as an equivalent to the use of the energy that's typically consumed in a normal household in their region. Now imagine that one application that could be running hundreds of applications. If they're using these technologies to improve the use of energy and reduce the emissions associated with that footprint, they're saving on the order of each application that runs the equivalent of a household. And that's really impressive. And you don't get there without visibility into the details, which come from network intelligence, monitoring, analytics, and all the sort, in order to keep us in check as to what we're consuming on the site.
Absolutely, and yeah, one of the products there comes to mind because I know we recently won an award with it, was the network scorecard. So being able to benchmark where you are, and I think to Valentin's point earlier, it's maybe not necessarily a question of absolutes, it's a question of relatives, right? So understanding where you're at and where you can make improvements rather than necessarily a finite number. It's knowing where you stand today and then being able to identify where you can improve. So the visibility becomes really important. So excellent. We'll close out. We're getting close to time, so I'll close it out, if I may, with one last question to you, Valentin, because I know you're heavily involved in the technical developments around this area. Can you just give us a short insight into some of the things you see coming down the line, perhaps with partners like Intel, for example, because hardware has a lot to play here, the interaction of hardware and software. What are some of the highlights that you think people should look out for from a technical roadmap perspective?
Yeah, of course, technology is always improving, and power management, especially for telcos, used to be more of a bad word because, again, it can be unpredictable. But the parts that were unpredictable can be addressed. For example, Intel with Ice Lake have reduced the time it takes to switch between these voltage frequency states down to under 1 microsecond. So you don't have that jitter anymore that used to be associated with a P state change. That's just one of the examples. There's also increasing work in DPDK power management, because these pole threads run all the time and they don't really do much most of the time, depending on time of day and demand, of course. So there's increasing efforts to make that more efficient, and we're working closely with Intel on that front together. Another part would be, instead of using x86 for everything, why don't we offload? And our DPU story really has a large potential there, because if you can do something with specific custom hardware that then can do the job a lot more efficient than general of the mill x86, then there could be a huge saving there, especially if you do that for the network in, again, the amount of hosts it takes to run a proper DU.
And I guess one of the key things with that is having the flexibility to dynamically configure some of that hardware as well. So we want to be able to maximize the use of certain pieces of hardware where it makes sense, but we also don't want to necessarily lock ourselves to a particular configuration per se, to maintain that flexibility, which comes back to the embracing virtualization that we talked about at the beginning. Excellent. Well, we're very much on time now, so we'll call it a day at that. Thank you ever so much, Valentin and Stephen, for joining. Next time is actually, I think, going to be the last one in the series on sustainability, and we're actually going to switch it away from the technology and look at things like institutional barriers. So what are the other things that go on in organizations that can impact positively or negatively sustainability objectives? So that'll be the subject of the next session. Until then, thank you guys for joining us, and thanks everybody for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.